The first laugh came before she had even reached her table. A woman in a red gown standing near the entrance of the grand ballroom of the Hargrove Hotel in Charlotte, North Carolina, turned to the woman beside her and did not lower her voice. She said, "Did they start letting homeless women into the gala?" The women at her table laughed. Not quietly, not with the specific social embarrassment of people who know they are being cruel and are doing it anyway. They laughed openly, the way people laugh when they are confident that everyone around them shares their view of the world and that the person being laughed at does not count as someone who might hear them. A waiter nearby glanced over and then looked away quickly. Two men at the adjacent table turned to see what was funny. Margaret Ellis heard all of it. She did not stop walking. She did not look at them. She simply continued moving through the room with the specific quiet of a woman who had decided a long time ago that she was not going to give the wrong people the satisfaction of watching her react. But something in her jaw tightened just slightly, and her right hand pressed the gray coat a little closer against her side. Just for a second. Then she released it and kept walking. She was 7 months pregnant. The gray wool coat had a tear along the left shoulder seam, the kind of tear that happens when something has been worn so many times and with such consistency that it begins to surrender at its edges. Her shoes were clean but worn. Her hair was neat but simple. She carried no clutch bag, no designer anything. In a room where the women wore gowns that cost more than most people spent on a month of groceries, Margaret Ellis looked, to every eye in that ballroom, like someone who had walked through the wrong door. Crystal chandeliers threw golden light across polished marble floors. Ice sculptures shimmered on the serving tables. Nearly 800 guests, CEOs, investors, city council members, charity board directors, commercial real estate executives, moved through the space with the specific ease of people who had been in rooms exactly like this one many times before and who understood all of its unspoken rules. Margaret understood them too. She simply was not performing any of them tonight, and the room had already noticed. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. A woman at the third table from the entrance watched Margaret pass and leaned toward the man beside her. He listened, glanced at Margaret's coat, and smiled in the way people smile when they are not entirely comfortable with what is being said to them, but do not want to exclude themselves from a social signal coming from someone with status. At another table, a woman in silver jewelry took her phone out. She held it at a low angle. She appeared to be taking a photograph. Margaret did not look at her. She moved through the room, and she found the seat that had been reserved in her name on the registration card, and she sat down. A waiter approached her table a few minutes later. He looked at the seats around her, all empty, and then he looked at her coat, and his expression did something very specific and very brief that a person paying close attention would have caught. He asked if she was certain she was at the right table. Margaret looked at him evenly. She said yes, she was certain. He nodded once and moved away without making eye contact again. Across the room, the woman in the red gown was watching. She smiled at something the woman beside her said. Neither of them was looking at the table settings. Margaret Ellis grew up in Greensboro, North Carolina, in a 2-bedroom apartment on South Elm Street, with a mother named Ruth who cleaned houses for a living, and a father named Harold who drove long-haul trucks across state lines. She grew up watching both of them maintain a dignity that nothing they lacked ever managed to touch. Ruth made dinner at 6 o'clock every evening. Every single evening, regardless of how long the day had been, because she understood that a hot meal at a regular time was its own form of steadiness. Harold came home on weekends and was present in the way that the best working parents are present. Not always physically available, but always emotionally honest. Never pretending they had more than they had. Never letting the havingless become a source of shame. Margaret absorbed all of this before she had language for it. She absorbed it the way children absorb the things they witness repeatedly from people they love, not as lessons, but as the operating conditions of the person they are becoming. By the time she was 16, she already knew something that most people spend their whole lives trying to learn. She knew that what you wear and what you own are not the same thing as who you are. And she knew that the people who confuse those two things are usually the ones who understand least about either. The moment that set the course of everything happened on a Tuesday morning in January. Not the January of the gala, an earlier one. Margaret was sitting at a diner table with her mother Ruth when the call came through. She had spent 15 years building her professional life inside the nonprofit housing sector of Charlotte, North Carolina. She had started at 22 as the youngest program coordinator a transitional housing organization called Second Step had ever hired. She had spent 4 years there, learning everything the organization had to teach, and then learning the things it had never thought to teach, by asking questions nobody else was asking. She had built a private file of institutional failures and system gaps that she added to every week, every month, every year, not knowing exactly what she would do with it one day, but knowing with the certainty of someone who has made a quiet decision that she would do something. When she left Second Step for a larger organization called Horizons Family Services, she carried the file with her. Over 6 years at Horizons, she rose to Chief Operating Officer. She redesigned their case management structure, which reduced the average family shelter stay from 47 days to 29. She built the funding application infrastructure that secured 2 federal grants the organization had never been able to access before. She did this in her own time, in the evenings, without being asked, because it needed doing. And then the board of Horizons eliminated her position. She sat in her driveway for a long time after she packed the box and drove home. The January air was cold. She had the engine off. She sat in the specific silence of a woman who has just had 15 years rearranged by one phone call and who is deciding, in the quiet of a cold car in a driveway, what the rearrangement means. She could feel the weight of what had been taken. She also could feel the weight of the file, the 15 years of documentation, the relationships, the knowledge of every gap in every system she had worked inside. She had been given something she had never had before, unscheduled time, and she was going to use every hour of it. She went inside, she made dinner. She did not tell David everything she was feeling. But later that night, he found her at the kitchen table with the laptop open and the files spread around the coffee cups, and he set a glass of water beside her, without saying anything, and went back to bed. He understood. That was the thing about David Okafor. He had always understood. Back in the ballroom, the evening was moving forward. Margaret had been sitting at her table for 20 minutes now. A woman from a nearby table walked past, glanced down at the torn shoulder seam of the gray coat, and kept walking without speaking. A man in a dark suit at the adjacent table said something to the woman beside him, and they both looked over briefly. The woman in the red gown, Catherine Hollis, who had been on the board of the Mecklenburg County Emergency Housing Coalition for 4 years, who had attended every annual gala, who had never once attended a site visit or a direct service day, was still watching from across the room. She had noticed something that she could not yet fully account for. The pregnant woman in the torn coat had been sitting at her table for 20 minutes, and nobody had come to ask her to leave. In fact, the opposite had happened. The city council member who chaired the county's housing committee had walked directly to her table, leaned down and spoken to her for 3 minutes with the specific focused attention that politicians give to people whose opinions they need to track carefully. Catherine watched this. Her champagne glass was very still in her hand. She was not laughing now. She was watching. But she did not yet understand what she was watching. In the 18 months between the January driveway and the October ballroom, Margaret Ellis built the Ellis Foundation from a kitchen table. She incorporated in the summer of 2018. She applied for 7 grants in the first 8 months and was awarded 4. She identified a former hotel property in Northwest Charlotte that the city had been unable to repurpose for 3 years due to a combination of zoning complications and funding gaps that Margaret, having documented every version of this specific problem in multiple organizations over 15 years, understood exactly how to address. She spent 4 months on the zoning application alone. She spent 6 months on the capital campaign. She raised $2.7 million. She did it while 7 months pregnant, in meetings where people who had not heard of the Ellis Foundation yet looked at her across conference tables and made the same specific assessment in 3 seconds that the woman in the red gown would make later in the ballroom. She knew what they were thinking. She had always known what they were thinking. She presented the data anyway. The data had no coat, and the data was extraordinary. By the time October arrived, the Ellis Family Transitional Housing Center in Northwest Charlotte was open. 40 units, wraparound services, 412 families served in the first 18 months of the foundation's existence. The Federal Housing Authority had already cited the program model in a regional report on best practices in transitional housing. The chairman of the MAC had toured the facility 3 weeks earlier, walking through every unit with Margaret, and had called her 2 months before the gala to ask if the organization would accept a formal partnership welcome at the annual event. He had asked if she would cut the ribbon. She had said yes. She had then driven directly from the final site inspection of the week to pick up her dress from the dry cleaner and discovered the dress was lost. She had driven home. She had changed into the gray coat. She had not thought it mattered. She was thinking about one of the families now, as she sat at her table in the ballroom. A woman named Sandra, who had arrived at the Northwest Charlotte facility 3 weeks earlier, with 2 children and 11 weeks of living in her car behind her. Margaret had been there the day Sandra received her key. She had watched Sandra stand at the door of her unit and put the key in the lock and turn it and push the door open and stand in the doorway for a long time without moving. Just standing there, looking at the kitchen, looking at the window with the morning light coming through it. Margaret had not said anything. There was nothing to say. Sandra had turned around eventually with an expression on her face that Margaret did not have a word for, and that she suspected nobody had a word for, the specific expression of a person who has been given back something they thought was gone permanently. Margaret thought about Sandra's face while people on the other side of the ballroom decided what her coat said about her. She adjusted the tear on her left shoulder with 2 fingers and straightened in her chair and accepted the glass of water that the waiter placed in front of her. She thanked him. He did not make eye contact. Something shifted in the room at around 8:30. It was not dramatic. It was the kind of shift that happens slowly and then all at once, like light changing in a room when a cloud moves. People began to notice that the woman in the torn gray coat was being spoken to by people whose proximity to this gala meant something specific. The Federal Housing Authority representative had stopped at her table. The chair of the county housing committee had stopped twice. A woman who Margaret knew from her years at Horizons and who was now running a significant foundation of her own had come to sit with her for 7 minutes and left with a handshake that contained warmth and mutual respect in equal measure. Catherine Hollis was watching all of this now from across the room with a champagne glass that had not moved in 15 minutes. The woman in the silver dress beside her said something. Catherine did not answer immediately. Her eyes were on the pregnant woman in the torn coat and on the specific quality of the conversations happening at her table and on a man at the head of the room who was preparing to take the microphone. She did not know yet what she was looking at, but something was happening at the edge of her understanding, something she could not yet bring into focus. Robert Vance was the chairman of the Mecklenburg County Emergency Housing Coalition. He was 61 years old and he had been running organizations and chairing boards in Charlotte's nonprofit sector for longer than many of the people in this room had been in professional life. He had spent 3 weeks at the Ellis Family Transitional Housing Center the previous month. He had read every page of the program outcomes report. He had read the federal citation. He had sat with Margaret in the Northwest Charlotte facility and listened to her describe the program model with the specific, unhurried clarity of someone who has thought about something for 15 years and has finally built it into physical form. He picked up the microphone at 8:40. He thanked the attendees. He spoke about the work of the MACLIC over the preceding year. He said he wanted to acknowledge something specific about the state of affordable housing work in Mecklenburg County. He said that earlier in the year, the coalition had entered a formal partnership with a newly established organization. He said this organization had accomplished in 18 months what most organizations in this sector take a decade to reach. He said it had just opened a 40-unit permanent transitional housing facility in Northwest Charlotte. He said it had served 412 families. He said the coalition was formally welcoming this organization into its partner network tonight. He said he had asked the founder to join him at the front of the room. The room was listening with the polite attention of 800 people who expected this to be another standard recognition moment. Robert Vance said her name, Margaret Ellis. There was a pause, and then something in the room changed that could not be changed back. He stepped off the stage. People assumed he was walking toward the front row. The front row was where the major donors sat, the people whose names appeared on the backs of chairs and the sides of buildings, and the annual reports in letters large enough to see from across a room. He walked past the first table in the front row. He walked past the second. He kept walking. The room began to track him. Conversations died at the tables he passed. Heads turned slowly, the way heads turn when something unexpected is happening, and the brain is still trying to decide what category to place it in. Someone's champagne glass stopped halfway to their mouth. Catherine Hollis had set hers down completely. She was watching Robert Vance walk across the ballroom floor. Her smile was still on her face, but it had stopped moving. The woman in the silver dress had gone very still beside her. Robert Vance kept walking. He was carrying a velvet box. The velvet box contained the ceremonial gold scissors that the Megalic had used at every significant organizational moment for 11 years. He walked past the second row. He walked past the third. He walked through the center of the ballroom. 800 people were watching his footsteps. Nobody was talking. The only sound was his shoes on the marble floor and the very specific silence of a room that has suddenly understood that it does not know what is happening. And then he stopped. He stopped in front of a table that nobody in the front rows had paid any significant attention to. He stopped in front of a pregnant woman in a torn gray coat who had been sitting at that table for 40 minutes while the room decided she was in the wrong place. He opened the velvet box. He held out the gold scissors. He said, "Mrs. Ellis, would you do us the honor of opening the Ellis Family Transitional Housing Center?" The silence that followed was the kind that rooms very rarely produce. Not the silence of people being quiet. The silence of people whose thoughts have stopped because the information arriving cannot immediately be processed. A champagne glass at a nearby table was set down with a sound that was audible across 3 tables in each direction. Someone at the far end of the room said something in a low voice and was not answered. A woman in the second row turned to the man beside her, and his expression told her that he understood as little as she did. Catherine Hollis was standing completely still. Her smile was gone, not tucked away, gone. Her face had the specific expression of someone whose understanding of the last 40 minutes has just been revised completely, and all at once, and the revision is happening in real time, in front of 800 people. The woman beside her, the one she had leaned toward when Margaret first walked in, had taken a half step back from Catherine without appearing to notice she was doing it. Margaret Ellis stood. She adjusted the tear on her left shoulder with 2 fingers. She straightened. She took the scissors from Robert Vance's hands. She thanked him. She turned to face the room. 800 people looked at the pregnant woman in the torn gray coat, holding the gold scissors. The woman who had arrived, looking like she did not belong in this room, was holding the object that said whose room it actually was. And the room knew it. Every single person in it knew it. All at once. She spoke for 4 minutes. She did not mention the coat. She did not look at Catherine Hollis. She did not reference the laughter, or the whispers, or the waiter who had asked if she was at the right table. She talked about Sandra. She talked about the 11 weeks in the car and the 2 children, and the key and the door and the window with the morning light. She talked about what it means to have a place that is yours, even temporarily, that has a door that locks and a kitchen with a working stove. She said that the Ellis Foundation existed because she had sat in a waiting room in Guilford County at 16 years old with her mother and understood what happened to families when the systems failed them, and she had made a decision in that waiting room that she was going to build something that did not fail. She thanked Robert Vance. She thanked the coalition. She handed the microphone back. She walked through the room. She passed within 4 feet of Catherine Hollis. Catherine Hollis did not move. She did not speak. Her champagne glass was still on the table where she had set it down when Robert Vance began walking. Margaret walked through the ballroom in her torn gray coat, and she did not look back. She did not need to. The room watched her until she reached the exit. The room was completely quiet. The Ellis Foundation served over 1,000 families by 2021. It opened a second permanent facility in 2023, 60 units in East Charlotte, with the gold scissors used again at the groundbreaking. Margaret's daughter, born 3 months after the gala, was there in a carrier on David's chest. Catherine Hollis resigned from the Mechanic Board in early 2020. The reason given was a scheduling conflict. The woman in the silver dress has not attended the gala since. These are simply the facts of what followed. They are not the point. The point is Sandra and the door and the key and the window. The point is 412 families. The point is what gets built by a woman who learned from her mother and her father that dignity is not something the world gives you and not something the world can take. You carry it in. You carry it through. You carry it out. They laughed at the coat. The coat was what she wore when she was doing the work, and the work was the most expensive and irreplaceable thing in that room. It always had been. Drop your location in the comments right now. Tell us where you are watching from tonight. Subscribe to this channel and turn on the notification bell, because next week we are telling you the story of a man who was told by 3 different doctors that he would never walk again, who built an entire organization from a wheelchair over 4 years, and who stood on 2 feet on the day the building bearing his name was dedicated. That story is next week. Do not miss it.